I now look to Sir Mark Rowley to open the case for the opposition.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. President, for the invite. So I'm here to oppose this ill-considered motion. It is wrong in principle. It implies that to protect oneself is wrong, as it risks creating further aggression. Second, it avoids the gritty, challenging and complex, brutal realities of the state's prime role to protect the citizen. Thirdly, it naively plays into the hand of extremists who seek to radicalise by implicitly supporting their radicalising script with messages that the West are the terrorists and the true Muslim martyrs are simply defending themselves. Fourthly, it does what those in armchairs always do. It criticises leaders' decisions without offering a better plan. So, the war on terror, not a phrase I would choose, more one used by the media than by politicians or police officers. But what we're talking about here is the Western allies' assertive strategies and efforts to confront the modern threat of terrorism. My own view is that any government who takes seriously its duties to protect its citizens, reflecting that terrorism is indeed political violence designed to kill the innocent and destabilise the state, will put enormous energies into confronting terrorism and use a balance of prevention and enforcement. It will be imperfect as solutions to problems always are, but we should not, for attention-seeking reasons or for partisan political reasons, undermine those efforts, as it simply works to the terrorists and the radicalisers' advantage. I will expand my argument and illustrate it by addressing what is actually the origin of the terrorism threat that we face, what's the tough reality that those of us who've done these operational roles face in protecting us from terrorism, how do radicalisers produce and recruit the next generation of terrorists, and what can we do better? So strategically, what are we confronting? It is not, as described in the opening proposition, a recent construct. This is a result of a long geopolitical curve which has produced escalating jihadist Islamist violence. There is an implication in the question that we have created the challenges of today, or at least made them far worse than they otherwise would have been, on the back of our response to 9/11. A little history assists. If we look at the curve to the 70s, 80s and 90s, we see Islamist jihadist violence growing. In the 90s, one can see attacks across the world: Algeria, Saudi Arabia, the United States, the Philippines. Today, we see most news about Afghanistan and Iraq, of course, but the problem is much wider than that. The escalation is global. It is not simply based on the narrow parameters described in the opening proposition. We can look at sub-Saharan Africa, look at the escalating effects of Boko Haram in the west of Africa, Al-Shabaab in the east. Look at the growing threat in India and Bangladesh from Islamist terrorists. Look at Southeast Asia, and particularly look at southern Philippines and the efforts for a group affiliated to ISIS to declare an occupied area around the city of Marawi as an Islamic state or a caliphate. We can look further back in history, which again I think is instructive. So in 1683, King Jan Sobieski of Poland, leading a broad coalition, saved Vienna from the siege that had been running there. And the defeat of the Ottomans followed and led to the squeeze of the Ottoman Empire, which ran all the way through to the First World War. This turning round of the Ottoman Empire's fortunes started on September the 11th. It is not a coincidence that that's the date that was chosen for the awful attacks in America. If one looks at ISIS propaganda, you can see sweeping historical references. You can see in their literature, and I hope I'm the person in the room who's read most of the ISIS propaganda. If there's anybody else in here who's read more than me, then I'm deeply, deeply worried. When you look at it, it has broad historical references. For example, it talks about returning Andalusia to the Caliphate. This is not a simple construct of a post-9/11 Western response. It's part of a longer curve. So, second, what's the gritty reality of protecting us all? So I spent 4 years leading the police counter-terrorism machine in this country. I have very bad timing. It was my second day in the role that al-Baghdadi, the leader of Daesh, declared the caliphate. And I saw an escalation to some of the busiest time in decades. And besides the global threats we see that we're talking about tonight, I would also mention the right-wing threat that has also been escalating at the same time with different causes. The same tools, the same laws, the same tactics are applied to that. It's perhaps not subject to tonight's debate, but I wouldn't want to avoid mentioning it. Anyway, the Islamist threat, the connectivity to the world, enables these threats to project from hollowed-out states, either directed, people reaching from a safe location and directing attackers in the West, or inspired with the propaganda they produce. The internet has enabled terrorism to move from being solely about highly organised small groups to one that's able to behave more as a cult, with radicalising propaganda that affects vulnerable people in their bedrooms, spending too long browsing across unpleasant sites. In my tenure, we prevented late-stage 23 attacks that were planned on the streets of the UK. That's in 4 years. Besides that, there was an immense amount of preventative work. The prevention work that is stopping tens of individuals from being drawn toward radicalisation every month. At the other end of the spectrum, British military and intelligence activity overseas was helping identify and deal with the threats that people over there were presenting to people on the streets of the UK. The exceptional ability of the UK and some allies to reach in and target those who are planning live time attacks on the streets of the UK and other European countries is absolutely critical. The reality is that, 3 fatal Islamist attacks led to 35 deaths last year, which is ghastly. If you start to do the maths, 23 attacks prevented in late stage. If you then think about the impact of those prevented at earlier stages from radicalisation, if you look at the interventions overseas at those planning more sophisticated attacks, the possible numbers are far more ghastly. These are difficult challenges requiring very difficult solutions. I've seen several Prime Ministers and Home Secretaries up close dealing with these difficult situations, not least in Cobra meetings, whether post-attacks or seeking to deal with difficult issues overseas. Regardless of their politics or other attributes, they all instinctively feel very personally the first duty of the state to protect the citizen. They all see, as we do, the enormous tensions and challenges that, on the one hand, intervening to confront terrorism mitigates the threat, but on the other, there are wider risks that those interventions can propagate more reaction. Supporting this motion, I suggest, encourages a less determined approach and the likely increase of successful attacks.
Words of information. With respect to the honourable gentleman, you've talked a lot about the increasing threat of terror, which I think we're all aware of, but you haven't said anything about how the so-called war on terror is actually meaningfully dealing with these issues and not just exacerbating them.
Thank you. So that's where I was about to go to. So how do extremists radicalise? They radicalise by targeting the vulnerable. They target families with propaganda developed aimed at families to come and live in the perfect Islamic state. They target young men with promises of war and heroism. They use twisted interpretations of history, of the Quran, and to pull people towards their view of the world. It's a sophisticated marketing approach that is not simply standing on the events of the last 15 years and the response of the West. They aim to create a narrative that the West is Islamophobic, that the West are the terrorists, and that true Muslim martyrs are simply defending themselves. They apologise for terrorism. They describe people like Jihadi John as beautiful young men. We must not fall into the trap that radicalisers want, that if we agreeing with them, that we have created this problem. That is the script they are looking to use to radicalise people. What I would rather suggest is that we have to support the efforts of the state, imperfect as they are, to confront the threat and to deal with the dangers we face. But you should challenge securocrats, of which I've been one, to be better at what we do. I have no suggestion that what we've done in the past is perfect, but it has succeeded in preventing hundreds of attacks and suppressing the threat to a great degree. Some of the things that I think can be improved in the future all revolve around prevention. In the UK, we still spend 0.7% of GDP on overseas aid, which is important. We have a strong preventative approach at home. Not all countries do that. There is more that can be done to balance the effort between enforcement and prevention, but we shouldn't shirk from the idea that confronting terrorism is essential to all of our safety. There isn't an easy alternative solution, and I have yet to hear one from the opposite side. Thank you.